It began with the smell. Before the priest was summoned, before the death was recorded, before the servants stopped moving the body, there was the smell. It leaked from beneath the canopies of his bed like smoke from a dying house, a mixture of rotted meat, old milk, wet cloth, and something else, something metallic, something alive. The hallway outside his chamber remained cold even in summer, but the odor was warm, heavy, wet. Physicians arrived with gloves, not for sterility, for endurance. Servants gagged through their duties. Linen was changed and burned, not cleaned. Curtains were opened and never drawn again. They did not whisper, "The king is dying." They whispered, "The king cannot be moved." Henry VIII did not die quickly. He decayed. His body collapsed inward, not like a building, but like fruit left in the sun, skin intact for days while the inside turned to fluid. By the time his death arrived, it was not a rupture, but a relief. His legs could no longer carry him, not from age, but because the infection had tunneled deep beneath the skin, forming abscesses that would burst without warning. The ulcers were older than his final wife, older than his will. They had lived with him for over a decade, oozing, bleeding, crusting over, and then opening again. The King of England sat in his chamber while his legs dissolved beneath him. When he slept, they did not turn him. They could not. His weight tore the skin from his back. The linens had to be cut from the mattress. Flies collected around the corners of his frame, even in winter. Vinegar-soaked cloths were stuffed into window cracks, not to keep out cold, but to delay collapse. No one knew how to clean him without reopening something. No one wanted to try. And yet the rituals continued. Food was still delivered on gold trays, decrees still sealed with his trembling hand, the crown still displayed in the next room, as if the flesh it had once sat above was not liquefying slowly into the mattress. When he finally died, no proclamation was made, not at first. The body remained where it was. Doors were closed. The room was not blessed. It was ventilated. A basin of ashes was placed beneath the bed. It overflowed. The smell could not be excised. It had soaked into the wood, into the floor, into the wool. When they came to remove the body, it took 6 men and a silence that would not be broken for hours. The bed, soaked through, split at the base. The mattress caved. They did not salvage it. They did not try to dry or purify or preserve. They burned it, carried it out to the courtyard, set it alight before dawn, let the smell turn to smoke, and then to nothing. This was not sacrilege. It was necessity. It was the only way to unsee what they had seen. The last place the king had lived had become a threat to the illusion of monarchy itself. There was no dignity left to drape over the frame, no cleansing strong enough to rescue its wood. Henry VIII, sovereign ruler of England, had become a corpse that required fire not for mourning, but for containment. They had once written songs about his shoulders. Foreign ambassadors marveled at the symmetry of his calves. His chest, wide as a wine cask, was described in diplomatic letters as evidence of England's divine favor. Henry VIII's body was not simply a body. It was the state made flesh. It was used to anchor legitimacy, to radiate divine right, to suggest that England's power flowed directly from the marrow of its king. When he rode through London on horseback, it was not transport. It was performance. When he wrestled courtiers or danced in masked balls, it was not pleasure. It was propaganda. This was the age of sovereign masculinity, and Henry was its chosen vessel. Everything about his body was curated as myth, his height exaggerated in portraits, his waist squeezed into ceremonial armor that no longer fit, his face painted smoother with every passing year. The court did not merely lie for him, it structured its reality around him. Even his weight, excessive by his late 30s, was reframed as majesty. Gluttony became abundance. Stillness became gravitas. But the truth, even then, was known. Behind the cloth of gold and the hunting horns was a body already beginning to fail. The jousting accident in 1536 was not his first injury. It was simply the one that never healed. The king's body, once a canvas of power, began to turn against him in public. His walks grew shorter, his meals longer, his silences thicker. When he sat on the throne, it took more than strength. It took pain. His courtiers stopped looking directly at his legs. They learned not to flinch at the scent. And yet, the rituals of admiration continued. The myth had to be preserved even as the skin cracked and the wound seeped. His body had once conquered women and nations. Now it conquered space, requiring larger beds, wider chairs, thicker padding. It consumed physicians and prayers alike. What no one admitted was that the king's body had become an accusation against the system that tied virtue to virility, against the divine right that demanded perfection, against the history that would try to remember him as anything other than a man being eaten alive from the inside. The rot did not stay hidden. It shaped policy. It shaped court fear. Every decision he made was filtered through fever, pain, and frustration. But still they bowed. Still they cheered. Because to admit the body was failing was to admit the myth had expired. And so, when the ulcers burst, when the bed stank, when the room had to be emptied of flowers, because nothing masked the decay, none of it could be named. They called him Majesty, even when the pus soaked through his robes. They wrote of his wisdom while servants scrubbed blood from his slippers. The nation clung to the idea that the king still symbolized order, even as he leaked, even as he groaned, even as they burned the things that touched him. He remained their sovereign. But the body had already declared the truth. The king was not England. He was what England could not yet admit, dying, bloated, and ruled by infection. The wound that unmade him began as a bruise. A fall from his horse during a joust in January 1536, briefly unconscious, blood pooling beneath his armor, the breath leaving the court in terrified silence. He rose days later, but something inside him had shifted. The impact had ruptured more than muscle. It severed the fiction of invincibility. Beneath his right thigh, a lesion opened. It never fully closed. A pocket of infection nested there, deep and secret. For weeks it was dressed, then for months, then for years, and eventually it became a companion, silent, foul, and unmentioned. The ulcer grew not outward, but inward. The skin around it thickened, yellowed, split. It leaked constantly, even when bandaged tight with linen and padded with wool. The physicians could not treat it. They could only manage its pace. Poultices were applied, herbal concoctions pressed into the rot, but the smell persisted, sweet, metallic, and warm. It coated his clothing. It filled the chambers. Men bowed quickly and exited faster. The corridors near his rooms were permanently scented with vinegar and ash, not from ritual, but from desperation. And yet pride endured. Henry refused to be seen as disabled. He demanded to ride, to hunt, to walk unsupported. Servants were punished for offering an arm. Advisors learned to present documents only when he was seated, never when rising, never when moving. His pain was absorbed into ceremony. No one asked how he slept. No one dared mention that he could no longer kneel at chapel. His flesh had become too fragile. The wound on his leg would split if pressed too hard. The muscle beneath it was turning soft. At night, when the dressings were changed, the screams were muffled behind tapestries, and in the morning he smiled through clenched teeth and called for music. The king's boots were redesigned to hide the swelling, his thrones retrofitted with cushioning to prevent bleeding. Pages were trained not to react when he winced, and still the infection spread. Slow, remorseless, unspoken, it began to affect his gait, then his breath, then his sleep. The wound stopped being a leg injury. It became a system. His blood, already thick from overeating and age, moved sluggishly. Fevers came and went. Sores appeared elsewhere, small at first, then peeling open without warning. His skin bruised if touched. His weight increased, not from appetite, but from immobility, and the wound never closed. This was not merely decline. It was wrought with hierarchy. Physicians lied to courtiers. Courtiers lied to ambassadors. Ambassadors wrote back to their kings of a monarch who ruled from behind scented curtains. The ulcer had become a shadow government. It dictated who entered the king's room, how long they could speak, how quickly they must leave. It informed every decision through pain and the avoidance of pain. It controlled the king more fully than his counselors did, and yet no one dared name it. They said the king was in retreat. They said he preferred privacy. They said he was meditating on scripture. What they meant was, the wound is leaking again. The linen is soaked. The servant vomited. The mattress must be replaced. His leg, once a pillar of courtly strength, was now a warning. This is what happens when flesh pretends it can carry a kingdom forever. This is what it means when pride is fed until it splits. The body's decay did not remain physical. It crawled upward, soaking into the mind. As the flesh loosened and leaked, the certainty that once anchored Henry VIII began to erode. He had once governed through magnetism, his presence drawing loyalty, fear, admiration. Now he ruled through suspicion. Where once he trusted charm, he now trusted locks. His meals were tasted, his rooms watched, his court moved as if under glass, every word measured, every expression suspect. The ulcer on his leg became a metaphor for his reign, hidden, dangerous, worsening in silence. Control became obsession. The kitchen was his kingdom now. He ordered menus with the precision of military campaigns. Roasted swan, marrow pastes, piles of candied fruit, meat boiled in wine. The volume of food was not gluttony. It was architecture. It was proof that power still passed through his teeth, but eating no longer brought joy. Each bite was work. He chewed slowly, as if digesting pain. He ate surrounded by silence, with courtiers standing by not to serve, but to witness. To eat with the king was no longer an honor. It was an ordeal. The room would not move until he had finished. The table would not clear until he gave the sign. Sometimes he stared at the food for hours, untouched. The food was never the problem. It was the performance. To consume was to command, and yet the digestion betrayed him. His belly swelled, his breath shortened, his sleep became fitful, interrupted by cramps and groaning. The bowels, overworked and inflamed, failed to keep pace. Chambers had to be discreetly emptied, clothes discreetly changed. He no longer rose from meals. He remained seated, eyes fogging, sweat beading along his jaw, hands trembling slightly as he reached for the same piece of bread he had already held 3 times. Servants learned to look away, not out of politeness, but out of necessity. The court began to fragment around him. Some stayed close, speaking only in affirmations. Others drifted to distant rooms, citing duties elsewhere. Ambassadors noted the change. One wrote of a sovereign whose appetite remains, though his temperament has cooled into something unmeasurable. That was diplomacy for fear. Henry did not shout anymore. He whispered. He whispered about betrayal, about Anne's ghost, about sons lost and daughters too bold. His counselors spoke of treason the way physicians speak of fever, something that can return at any time, triggered by nothing. He revised his will compulsively. Clauses added, erased, rewritten in different inks, names shuffled, titles reassigned. He no longer trusted his own bloodline to carry out his vision. Every piece of parchment became a fortress, every signature a scream. Those close to him learned to nod without agreeing, to obey without acknowledging. They dressed his body as it swelled. They praised his decisions as they contradicted themselves. They prayed aloud while slipping on gloves to protect against infection. And all the while, the wound beneath the bandages continued its work. The infection was no longer confined to his leg or his bowels or even his mind. It had become the air. The court lived inside his body now, a decaying ecosystem, ruled by the movements of a man who could not stand, whose meals ended in silence, and whose breath came in shallow, fetid waves. His mind had begun to mirror his anatomy, swollen, ruptured, and closing in on itself. There is a threshold at which rot ceases to be a smell and becomes a presence. By the end of his life, Henry VIII's chambers had passed that threshold. The stench no longer came from his body alone. It had saturated the air, the walls, the furniture. The tapestries grew heavy with it. The wood paneling swelled with the moisture of his decay. No window could clear it. No herb could outmatch it. The palace became a mausoleum built around a living corpse. To enter his rooms was to step into something damp, dark, and irreversible. The bed had to be layered in shifts. Mats, straw, wool, linen, all of it stacked not for comfort, but for absorption. And still, it soaked through. Night after night, his ulcers opened without warning. His bowels, too weakened to signal, failed in silence. Servants spoke in murmurs, eyes lowered, breath held. Buckets of lye water stood constantly by the door, not for ritual cleansing, but for the mop. The ritual was no longer one of state. It was one of containment. The scent drew no flies in winter, but in spring they came. Small clouds gathered near the foot of his bed, then along the casements. They were brushed away, but returned. Guards stationed near his chamber kept cloth over their faces. One collapsed during watch, not from illness, but from the weight of it. The unspoken truth was that Henry, once the center of courtly radiance, now corroded every room he entered. Even his chapel was altered. The incense burned. There was not for the divine. It was for him. To keep the air moving. To keep the courtiers from gagging during mass. Gowns had to be burned, chairs abandoned. No one kept clothing that had touched him for too long. Servants whispered about the sickness, though they knew no name for it. It was not plague, it was not fever, it was royal rot, and it moved without permission. His dogs refused to lie near him. His hunting hawks grew restless when perched in the antechamber. Visitors, once proud to be summoned, now asked for shorter audiences or claimed illness to delay their turn. Only the loyal or the terrified remained. And yet every morning, the rituals resumed. The canopy above his bed was opened. The water warmed. The king, if he had not bled through his sheets, was dressed in fresh layers. Velvet, fur, gold thread, covering not strength, but corrosion. Courtiers still lined the hallway, though their eyes flickered toward the windows. They bowed not to majesty, but to endurance. Their monarch had become a site of survival. They stood not to receive favor, but to prove they could withstand what he had become. The palace did not ring with music. It pulsed with caution. Every creak of floorboard, every flutter of curtain carried the question, has he died yet? And when he hadn't, the stench deepened. It was not just the smell of wounds. It was the smell of failure, of divinity liquefying, of a kingdom breathing through the mouth, trying not to inhale what power had become. He knew he was dying, long before the physicians whispered it in closed rooms, long before the clerics circled his chambers with muttered Latin and uneasy hands. Henry VIII had already begun to prepare for the end, but not through reflection, not through remorse. His response was paper, parchment stacked high beside his bed, ink pots replenished twice daily, seals pressed with shaking hands. He wrote his will not as a dying man, but as a king still clinging to choreography, writing himself into permanence while his body spilled itself into the sheets. The act of writing became a form of resistance. His hand, once broad and commanding, now trembled, swollen with fluid, stained with the same sickness that soaked his legs. Signatures took minutes. Sentences were dictated, redacted, then dictated again. The will swelled with names. Councils, protectors, godparents, traitors, many of them scratched out in later drafts, replaced with rivals, friends, ghosts. The pages were not instructions. They were evidence that he still ruled, that he still mattered, that flesh had not failed him as fully as breath suggested. He made decisions no one understood, elevated men he had previously imprisoned, denied titles to sons of the noble dead. In one revision, he removed the name of a trusted advisor. In the next, he restored it, then underlined it 3 times. Some days he forgot what had been written the day before. Other days he demanded to hear the full text from beginning to end, only to interrupt with questions that had no answers. Is my son strong? Will they obey the crown? Have you burned the bedding? He did not ask about salvation. He did not speak of God, not as a destination. He spoke of property, of borders, of coins and castles and brides yet to be chosen. His thoughts remained territorial, even as the infection rose through his torso and settled in the hollows beneath his arms. When the physicians lanced the ulcers, the fluid came dark and slow. They stopped reporting the truth. They feared the stink more than they feared misdiagnosis. The will was the only thing still clean, pages wiped by gloves, seals warmed by candlelight, words recited through cloth to keep the voice from breaking. Each clause read like a ledger of paranoia, every heir shadowed by contingency, every gift loaded with suspicion. His words tried to command the future the way his body had once commanded the court. But the paper could not hide the smell. The scribes wrote quickly. They knew time was short. They knew the king's last words would not be spoken. They would be written, misread, interpreted in silence by men who had already begun carving up his legacy. He could not walk. He could not sleep. He could not be touched without flinching. But he could still dictate. And so he did. He dictated through pain, through fever, through blood that would not clot and breath that came in rasping intervals. The will became not a plan for the kingdom, but a denial of his condition. As long as the sentences continued, he could pretend the rot had not won. As long as ink moved, he could pretend the body had not stopped. He died before the final version was sealed. Some say he asked to read it one more time. Others say he simply closed his eyes and refused to wake. But by then, it no longer mattered. The will was stained. The bed was soaked. The pages curled with the humidity of decay. What he tried to control in ink, his body had already disproven. The king was dead before the kingdom dared say so. There were no final audiences, no proud declarations, no dramatic farewells. In his last days, Henry VIII no longer resembled a king. He resembled a wound. The body that had once thundered across tournament fields now could not be lifted without tearing open. His skin, distended and translucent, had begun to leak from places no one dared describe aloud. He lay on one side for so long the flesh beneath him began to bruise, then necrotize. Shifting him was no longer an act of care. It was an act of damage. So they left him still, immobilized in rank linen, a sovereign decomposing by the hour. No one recorded what he said in those final days, if anything at all. Communication came in grunts, gestures, half-closed eyes. His mouth rarely opened. When it did, the breath that escaped was warm and foul, tinged with the stink of liver failure and old meat. His tongue had swollen, his teeth shifted, the swelling in his legs had migrated upward, and his groin now radiated heat, infection, and the purple sheen of blood beneath the surface. Blisters appeared along his hips. They burst without prompting. No servant volunteered to clean him twice. The mattress beneath him collapsed in the middle. The straw had to be replaced nightly. When the sores on his back began to split open, they stuffed herbs into the cavities, not to heal them, but to mask them. Cloves, sage, mustard seed. Nothing worked. The stench of internal collapse always returned. The room was kept dark, not for solemnity, but because his skin had become so thin the light itself seemed to agitate it. He no longer tolerated warmth, and yet he shivered constantly. He was alternately drenched in sweat and dry as parchment. They changed his linen 4 times a day. No one spoke of comfort anymore, only containment. He did not scream. Screaming requires energy. It requires a voice. What Henry had was groaning. Long, low sounds that seemed to crawl from somewhere beneath his ribs. Sometimes he whimpered. Once, they say, he cried. But no one confirmed it. The weeping of kings was not fit for records. His eyes remained open for long stretches, unblinking, then closed for hours, as if death had already claimed the lids and forgotten to finish the work. His beard was trimmed but uneven. His hair thinned and stuck to his temples. They powdered his cheeks. The effort made no difference. The court outside remained active. Decisions continued. Titles were shifted. Plans for the succession advanced in silence. No one dared tell the king that power had already moved beyond him. In the chamber itself, no prayers were spoken aloud. Clerics came, but did not stay. One collapsed in the hall after witnessing the dressing of his leg. No confession was heard, or if it was, it went unrecorded. The body no longer belonged to ceremony. It belonged to rot. He had become not a ruler, but a biological emergency. His breath came like boiling water, irregular, hot, angry. He moaned through sleep. He defecated without warning. The linens were carried out and burned in the garden. A servant slipped in his fluids and had to be dismissed for vomiting. No one remembered how to speak of him as Majesty. They said he now, or the king, or nothing. The body lay still. The king was already gone. What remained was a problem, and still no one moved him. The bed could not bear the weight. The skin could not bear the friction. The pride could not bear the truth. So they waited, for stillness to become final, for breath to stop, for the groaning to fade. And when it did, they didn't speak. They sealed the windows, they opened the doors, they stared at the body, and they waited to see if it would move again. He died in silence, not in the presence of angels, not beneath cathedral ceilings, but in a room soaked with his own fluids, the curtains drawn back just enough to let the stench escape. No trumpet called, no candle flickered with divine timing. He simply stopped. The breath, once rasping and unpredictable, failed to return. His chest did not rise. His mouth, half open from the night before, remained ajar. His eyes did not flutter. There was no last word, no epiphany, no dignity. Only the stillness of an object no longer pretending to speak. The servants stood still, not in reverence, in uncertainty. Who would touch him first? Who would be blamed if he was still alive and bruised in the handling? The physician approached last. The pulse was checked with a gloved hand. A mirror held to the mouth, just briefly, then withdrawn. No breath, no mist. The courtier standing at the door exhaled first. Not relief. Something closer to instruction. The rituals would begin, not to honor the dead, but to prevent contamination. They did not call it death, not at first. The message was coded. The king rests. The king will not rise today. Orders were dispatched, not from the bedchamber, but from the antechamber, filtered through layers of men who had already begun scrubbing his name from their plans. The door to his room remained closed, sealed, in fact, with cloth and vinegar. His bedding was not turned, his body not lifted. They waited for the right hour, not to mark the death, but to manage the reaction. Power had to shift before morning could be allowed. His corpse began to change within hours. The heat in the room, the thickness of his body, the saturation of infection, it all accelerated what had already begun long before breath left him. Gas built in the intestines. Fluids pooled along his back. The mattress, already stained, already failing, sank further. The body began to swell. The lips darkened. The skin beneath his arms grew soft. Servants were ordered not to describe what they saw, only to record the linen used, the time of the first rupture, the order in which the room was stripped. There was no lying in state. Not immediately. His body could not be preserved, only delayed. They packed him in herbs and cloth and nailed the coffin shut faster than protocol allowed. Even the most loyal were kept at a distance. The king's form had become unstable, already leaking, already reshaping itself into a version no portrait could recall. They removed him under cover of night. The coffin carried on a litter that creaked from the weight, sealed with pitch, not reverence. The corridor he passed through was scrubbed with ash. No prayers were said until the body was gone. No trumpets played. No songs were sung. Only after the last servant left the chamber did they return with torches. Not for honor. For the bed. The mattress was too stained. The linens too soaked. The frame too swollen with disease. They did not clean it. They did not save it. They carried it to the courtyard, doused it in oil, and set it on fire. And so Henry VIII left the world not in majesty, but in smoke, not in procession, but in containment. The king was dead, but it was his body that had to be destroyed. It was not ceremony. It was not mourning. It was not even caution. They burned the bed because no other act could match the shame of what remained. The mattress was not simply soaked, it was liquefied. It had absorbed too much of him. Blood, pus, sweat, feces, urine, and something else, something older, layers of infection layered over months, sometimes years. The cloth was no longer cloth, the straw no longer straw. It reeked with the density of something that had once lived and no longer did. The servants could not speak of it. They did not attempt to clean it. They wrapped the bed in oil-soaked sheets, dragged it down the back stairwell, and reduced it to ash before the morning frost lifted. It was not a symbolic fire. It was hygienic. But more than that, it was corrective. Henry's body had refused to die properly. It had refused to obey the aesthetics of royalty. His death, like his life, had expanded beyond the confines of ritual. The mattress bore witness to this, and so it had to be erased. Just as Catherine Howard's name was denied a gravestone, just as Anne Boleyn's bones were unmarked for decades, now Henry's bed, the site of his final breakdown, would be denied the relic it might have become. Because monarchy could absorb excess, it could absorb cruelty, lust, blood, even murder. But it could not absorb the image of a king decomposing in his own fluids, not without breaking. The fire was not public. It was done before sunrise. No bells tolled. No smoke was acknowledged. The ash was swept before noon. Nothing was salvaged. Not a splinter of wood, not a corner of sheet, not a gold thread. The room itself was aired for days, its stone floor scrubbed with vinegar and lye. Still, the smell clung. It lived in the cracks. The floorboards were later replaced. The walls whitewashed. Visitors were told nothing. They entered a different chamber. They stood where the king had once breathed, once ruled, once eaten, once failed, but they did not know. Burning the bed was an act of narrative control. The body could be embalmed. The will could be cited. The memory sculpted into portraits. But the mattress, soaked, flattened, sagging with infection, was unmanageable. It contained the truth that the sovereign had become a wound, that power had been reduced to excretion, that the divine right of kings could dissolve in sheets soaked with rot. It could not be allowed to remain, not as evidence, not as symbol, not even as rumor. And so they lit it, not to honor him, to remove him, one final act of concealment, not to preserve dignity, but to eliminate the record of its failure. The bed was not just furniture, it was the final throne. And when they burned it, they burned more than soiled cloth and ruptured straw. They incinerated the last artifact of a myth that had already collapsed under its own weight. Henry VIII had spent his reign constructing an image of absolute sovereignty, virile, divine, uncompromising. His body was not merely a vessel for policy, it was the policy. His decisions were extensions of his hunger. His marriages, wars, and executions were rendered with the same anatomy that ultimately betrayed him. And in the end, it was not an assassin, a rival, or a heretic who destroyed him. It was himself, slowly, invisibly, from the inside out. When a king dies in battle, his body is remembered with reverence. When he dies in bed, bloated and bursting with infection, he is remembered differently, if at all. Henry's final days were an erosion not just of flesh, but of the ideology that wrapped itself around that flesh. The same hand that severed monasteries, queens, and nations could not stem the slow leaking of its own blood. The monarchy had to retreat from that image. It could not risk a memory of Henry as soft, helpless, and decomposing. And so the bed was removed, the corpse was sealed, and the story was rewritten in portraits and print. But what was burned was more than biological. It was symbolic failure. The very notion that power could be embodied, that the health of the nation could be reflected in the health of the man, was rendered grotesque. England's body politic had become septic, and everyone could smell it. The ulcer on his leg was mirrored in the wounds of the realm: religious fractures, paranoid trials, broken alliances, illegitimate heirs. The king's skin had split just as the court had. His weight had swollen just as the bureaucracy had. His pain had multiplied just as fear had. The fire that consumed the bed was not a ritual of transition. It was a desperate severing. It said, "This never happened." It said, "Forget the liquid sounds, the rupture, the moaning." It said, "Remember only the armor, the crown, the anthem." But fire does not erase. It transforms. Ash clings. It settles into corners, beneath stone, into breath. Those who watched the flames rise from the courtyard that morning may have said nothing, but they carried the smell, and with it, the truth. That power, when unmoored from reality, always turns inward. It feeds on itself. It expands until it ruptures. Henry VIII did not die with dignity. He died swollen with power and pus, his will unfinished, his breath dragging between coughs, and still the monarchy survived him. But it did so by turning away, by closing the door, by setting fire to the thing that had held him as he finally collapsed, the bed that held a king who had become too real, too mortal, too ruinous to remember. This is what remains when power dies without grace: smoke, ash, and silence. No final proclamation, no triumphant passing. Only the slow cooling of a bed that could not be salvaged, a room that had to be scraped clean, a name that everyone still uttered, but with slightly more distance. Henry VIII's death was not tragic. It was procedural. The monarchy did not shatter. It recoiled. It braced itself against the stench of the king's failure, sealed the windows, and kept moving. But that stench lingered, not just in the fabric or the wood, in the air around memory, in the reluctance to speak plainly of what his final days became. He had governed as though he were immortal. He died as a man who could not sit up without tearing open. The great lie of divine kingship is not just that it imagines power to be sacred, it imagines flesh to be obedient, that bodies appointed by God will behave better than other bodies, that they will last longer, bleed less, smell cleaner. But Henry's body refused that script. It dissolved under pressure. It betrayed its king in the most humiliating ways, publicly, biologically, without pause. The very thing that made him dangerous in life, his presence, his appetite, his mass, made him unbearable in death. There was too much of him to manage, too much to preserve, and so they destroyed what they could, beginning with the bed. But fire cannot incinerate consequence. His decisions outlived him. His heirs were weak, manipulated, and sickly. His marriages had ended in death, annulment, and trauma. His kingdom fractured, repaired, and fractured again. His churches still bore the shape of his disruption. His paranoia had outlived his breath. No amount of burning could cauterize that. The monarchy emerged intact, but smaller, not in size, in certainty. Henry had shown that even the divine could rot, even the crown could leak, even the body anointed by God could stink so badly that it had to be erased with flame. And that is the final image, not of a man dying, but of a room sealed, a bed blackened, a fire rising in the dark before anyone dared to look. Not mourning, but removal, not tribute, but amnesia. Because to confront how he died is to confront how power really functions. Fragile, grotesque, and willing to burn its own bed to keep from being remembered too truthfully.